I'm Sarah Komisarow. I'm an assistant professor at the Sanford School at Duke University. And today I'll be talking about some of my joint work with my colleague, Robert Gonzalez, who has recently moved to Georgia Tech. And this is mostly based on our paper that appeared in the Journal of Public Economics in 2020 about community monitoring and crime, evidence from Chicago's Safe Passage program, but I'll try to highlight a few other things that we've done to expand upon this as I speak. Okay, so this paper, we're studying community monitoring intervention at scale and its effects on crime. This was a program that was carried out in a public school setting. So in the Chicago Public Schools, it's called the Safe Passage program. This is a community monitoring program that I'll describe in more detail in a moment, but we think of this as an unbundling of traditional policing tasks. And so what we mean by this is there's sort of a splitting off, if you will, of basic crime surveillance and reporting tasks that are handed off or sort of peeled off of the roles of a traditional police officer and handed to civilians in this particular setting. So the Safe Passage program, just in a nutshell, it established what are called safe passage routes around designated Chicago public elementary and high schools, and also middle schools. There aren't that many middle schools in CPS, but in any case, this is not all schools in Chicago, but specific schools were selected for this program. It started in the 2009-10 school year and continues to present, although I'll note that our study here ends with the 2017-18 school year. And so just to give you a little who, where, and when, the things I want to emphasize about this community monitoring program is that these are unarmed, paid civilians, and I should also add in there that these are adults who are employed by local nonprofit organizations. They're not employees of the Chicago Police Department nor of Chicago Public Schools, but they work for a local neighborhood organization that is contracting with Chicago Public Schools to provide these services. These community monitors stand watch on designated city blocks around CPS schools during school arrival and dismissal time. So that'll be sort of important for what I talk about on regular attendance days during the school year. So they're not there during the school day. They're only there when students are arriving and leaving. And then they're not there like on teacher professional development days, nor on the weekends, nor during the summer. If you look at the left-hand side of my slides, this is just a quick example of Kenwood High School in Chicago. And so you can see the school's location. It's the little blue sort of building icon and the route for safe passage monitors. So what I want to emphasize, these routes are selected based on sort of students' travel patterns, but they're not like square. They don't necessarily surround the school. And so they're selected with some intentionality with knowledge of the local community. Okay, so this program, it had two explicit stated goals. So one was to reduce the likelihood that CPS students would become victims of violent incidents. I think implicit in this goal is also the goal to reduce the likelihood that students are exposed to or witness violent incidents. And then secondly, this is a public education context. So the bigger goal of this program was to create a safe, secure, and supportive school environment to increase student attendance and improve academic performance. Robert and I have some related work forthcoming at Education, Finance, and Policy, where we show that this program actually decreases absences over after a number of years of implementation. So it's so here on the left-hand side, I'll just sort of Kenwood is one of the small segments here, but this is a little bit of what the program looked like in Chicago. I believe this is the 2014-15 school year. The program was sort of scaling up and expanding over time. And then on the right here, photo credit to the New York Times. The monitors have a visible presence on these routes. They wear bright neon vests and they're there every school day. And so it's known that this is sort of part of the students' arrival and dismissal, and they're part of sort of the school setting. So what we do in this paper, we combine two different sources of data. The first is something we put together by combining lots of information from Chicago Public Schools to put together and document the block level expansion of this program over time. And so we're using all sorts of different sources to sort of carefully document this. I'll show you some maps on the next page. And then we're pairing this documentation at the block level with crime data from the city of Chicago. It's perhaps known to people in this audience, but these are block level crimes. We're restricting to the school years between 2007-8 and 2017 and 18, and we're looking at We have this data that's available through the City of Chicago data portal that gives us information at the block level on different types of crimes, where they happened, and an indicator for whether they result in an arrest. So we're pairing this with what we've done to put together documentation of which blocks were covered by safe passage and when. So here's just an example showing you sort of the scale up over time. The program was pretty small, 40-something high schools in its initial year in 2009-10, and then by 2017-18, covering a number of elementary, middle, and high schools. Sort of enfolded in this were mass closings of public elementary schools in Chicago, and so the program did have some ties into that policy, which I think we tried to deal with reasonably in the paper. So what do? So we take this documentation of block level coverage of the Safe Passage program and use it to sort of classify all blocks in Chicago into 5 or so different groups. So for each school year, we're interested in whether that city block was covered by Safe Passage. These are in blue in this sort of like zoom in that I'm showing you on the left here, whether that city block was adjacent, so like abutting or intersecting a safe passage block, whether it was within a quarter mile, half mile, or just somewhere else contained within the neighborhood. In Chicago, we're using Chicago community areas as our proxy for neighborhoods. And so for each of these blocks, we're sort of classifying them into one of these groups, and then we're looking at the different types of crime that occurred at the block level. And so to not put up equations or do anything, what we're trying to do here is look at how the incidence or the total number of crimes at the block level changed within our safe passage blocks as the block shifted from sort of not having safe passage coverage to later having it, while sort of comparing that block on average to some other group of blocks in the city. And so just to give you some sense of what this looks like, this graph is for total crime. And so what we can show, we have figures like this in the paper, is that looking at all safe passage blocks on average in the years leading up to when safe passage was introduced, that's the vertical dashed line, crime was trending in a way that was fairly flat. So this doesn't mean that there were 0 crimes per block, but this means that crime wasn't changing relative to its sort of pre-safe passage level. And then upon the introduction of safe passage, we see this drop off in crime that's sort of immediate, followed by a longer and more steady decline over a number of years as the program gets sort of older, or there have been more years of coverage. So here's what this looks like in regression form. I think this maybe wasn't the best slide to include, but we do a number of things in the paper for those of you who are interested to try to be careful about which sets of blocks we're comparing our safe passage blocks to. And so our main results, I'll just highlight here, are that what we find is that violent crimes decrease by about 20% on average after the introduction of safe passages. Property crimes decrease by about 10%, and non-index crimes, which you can think of as other sort of lower level or miscellaneous offenses, includes things like gambling, embezzlement, fraud, anything that's not one of the main 2 other categories, those decline by 20% as well. And because these different types of crime start at different levels, we've scaled these decreases by the size of the typical size in terms of the number of blocks that have coverage around a school. And so we think another way to think of this is there are about 2 fewer violent crimes per safe passage school per year, 3 fewer property crimes, and 16 fewer non-index crimes per safe passage school per year. So this is pretty substantial in terms of thinking about reduced student exposure. I hope that I can keep going. I have a little cold here. All right, so one of the other, I think, contributions of this paper is that these main findings are not the whole story. So what we do is we try to take advantage of this very detailed data to talk about some of the other unintended consequences. So what we find is that there are very small increases of motor vehicle thefts on nights and weekends. We find some slight evidence of what we call cross-crime substitution. So larceny or theft decreases, but burglary, which occurs indoors, increases. So there's like this small trade-off in the location of crime. We do find some evidence of spatial spillovers and displacement. So some nearby nearby blocks get some monitoring spillover benefit, while there's some small increases in some types of crime in the most remote areas of safe passage neighborhoods. But none of these increases were large enough to offset our main declines. But we still think it's really important to talk about the ways in which this program changed the spatial and sort of timing of crime in Chicago. So we have some other results showing that crimes on school grounds decreased, which we think is really important to talk about given the setting of this program. And so I'll just sum up here. What we find is that the Safe Passage program generally succeeded in reducing crime, but it also had some small unintended consequences. And these unintended consequences were things like this cross-crime substitution, changes of time of day, and spatial displacement. And so we're thinking this is an important contributor to the policy conversation around alternatives to traditional policing, where we're taking unarmed civilians and putting them into a role where we've taken some policing tasks and unbundled them. Thanks so much for including me.